Rosario Granados. I'm the Carl and Marilyn Toma Associate Curator of Spanish Colonial Art. Long name, longer than me even. And that long name is, I always say that it's big because I work at the Blanton Museum, and from there, and thanks to a long-term loan of the Toma collection of South American art, we're trying to partner with other groups and institutions across the university to make a lot of noise around the importance of Spanish colonial art on campus. And we are very thrilled of partnering with the digital scholarship series organized by Lilas to bring scholars that can help us understand the artistic production of Latin America in this period in a very broad way. And it is my pleasure to introduce to you Juan Luis Suárez. He is a full professor at Western University in Ontario in Canada. He has been there for quite a bit of time, developing projects like the ones that he's going to be talking about. He is has joint appointments in the departments of modern languages and literatures and computer science, and he is the director of CulturePlex laboratory, which is an a project and that works with cultural analytics, helping understand human behavior, ranging from or comprehending the nuances of the peace processes in Colombia to the authorship of Golden Age, Spanish Golden Age literature. And I think this is what you can do when you're doing research through technology. And the talk that he's going to deliver today is called Hidden Patterns of Latin American Baroque Art, and I think it's going to be a fantastic way of showing all the possibilities that art of the colonial period can have for study. And he will shed light on the hidden patterns that he has discovered in the transmission of Baroque and colonial art in Latin America, through a combination of digital art history, data analysis, and cultural history. So please welcome, join me in welcome Dr. Suarez and enjoy the talk.
Thank you for coming out this afternoon. Thank you to the organizers for all the efforts and for having me here today. I'm going to talk about culture, art, music, Latin America, and how things move around and affect the behavior of people. I've seen both at the level of the objects and the people, but also at a higher level, not more important but complementary, in which we can observe patterns and understand things in a different way. I'm going to talk about Baroque and complexity, the idea of complexity. How basically the interactions between different individuals and individual units create the emergencies of things which are bigger and different from the very things that interact at a lower level, and how that plays out in the Baroque and in anything that has to do with the intersection and mixing of cultures and human groups. I'll talk about some evidence so that the lecture is not so boring. I will be asking you a few things. I'll explain how that works out with culture, and I will give you a couple of cases that we have studied related to Baroque and global culture, so that you have specific cases to make you think about how to apply this type of work to other instances. Baroque and complexity. Why is it the Baroque important? Because of a few reasons that have to do with today's situation. Today's, I mean the last 60, 70 years of our experience as humans in the whole planet. Baroque is important because it comes with international expansions of mainly the European powers, going to one way to Asia through the Portuguese expansion, and to America through England, France, Spain, and Portugal. So many of the things that we are seeing today are very related to those expansions, even if they are not that clearly based on the expansion of imperial powers. This brings a level of complexity that I think humankind, the human species, had not had before, or not at this level. This is part of what Eric Diamond calls the clash of the hemispheres, in which two worlds completely different and untouched before in terms of the flora, the fauna, the human groups, cultures, come together in such a dimension that we are still experiencing the effects of those exchanges. In cultural terms, it produces a lot of informational exchanges, because being on one side or the other, on the many sides that come together through that process, what we have is different repositories of cultural practices and cultural information that somehow come together and have to be synthesized and put to the use of these new communities. And the Baroque is especially important because of what this type of phenomena can tell us about what we are experiencing today, how to understand things that in some cases we perceive with a lot of anxiety when different cultural groups, different languages, different processes of migration happen, but it's something that has been happening for a while, of which we can learn certain aspects through the Baroque. The nice thing about the Baroque is that it's far enough that we have some distance, and so we are not so close to it. We can be a little detached, but at the same time we also have some data that we can use and extract information of. So this combination of farness and closeness, I think it's very convenient for this case. In traditional humanistic approaches, and this is a huge gross simplification, but for the sake of setting the stage, Baroque can be three things mainly. Can be something that we attribute to a specific piece of art, a novel, a piece of theater, a painting, a sculpture, a building, and then we say that those things are Baroque. For instance, a play by Calderón de la Barca, Lope de Vega, or by Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz are Baroque because they have certain internal characteristics that we have decided that we call them, when they come together, Baroque. But then historians also say that there are periods and genres when we put together a lot of pieces or a lot of authors over a period of time in a geography that are Baroque, all of them, okay? Which is fine too, but we'll go into the detail of the limitations of these approaches. And then starting in the 70s and 80s, and especially with Latin American researchers who came to American universities, they started to see their own countries as part of a general movement, and they started talking about Latin American Baroque in the present, but also in the past, as Baroque cultures, which are very complex. These things that we normally attribute to Hispanic people, they are noisy, all these things can come together. It's chaotic in Mexico, in Lima, and all these places, and that comes as similar to the things that we see in Baroque pieces of art. This complexity of things in which we can see certain patterns, but at the same time it's like, this is not completely organized, okay? So there are like these three levels of the work, the individual piece, and the historical periods or the genres, but also when we extend it through these theories, cultures can be more or less Baroque. In going to complexity theory, basically a complex system is formed by many elements that interact in such ways that unpredicted behaviors emerge from those interactions. My colleague and friend Vladimir Hachinsky, who is a very distinguished neuroscientist, he tried to explain things related to the brain using a very simple metaphor to talk about complex systems. He says this is like water and wetness. You cannot understand wetness by studying the molecules of water. They are connected, but they are something different. Okay, so this is what we are trying to ascertain in cultural system. What are the elements, and what is it that come out of those interactions between the elements? how do people, especially in the sciences, but also in geography, in health sciences, in economics, although the economists don't get anything right, as you know, try to study complex systems with three main tools: concepts, a very theoretical level, simulations, and networks, through network theory. Okay? So simulations are things like this. We have the weather forecast, and we have something which is like, and this should be a video, a simulation that we take as though this is the reality. So we see this and we know that it's going to rain or not over Spain because we know how those things move. But this is a computer simulation. It's a model of reality. It's not reality. Okay? The same thing can be done with culture. And there is something called agent-based simulations in which the agents are little computers in which you put information and behaviors according to the hypothesis that you think that has happened or you want to test, and you make them interact through different periods. And this information can be about human behavior, virus spreads and epidemics, anything. We have used several of these models and tools to try to explain informational exchanges between different groups of humans, cultural groups. You can also use network theory, and networks in the sense that the same networks that Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat use to connect us, but also to predict our behaviors and offer us all those ads that they use. All that is based on something mainly coming from physics, which is called mathematics, which is called the theory of networks, or as they say, they call it in mathematics, theory of graphs. Okay? In this case, this is an analysis of the publications of theater writers at the beginning of 17th century in Spain, focusing on one of the main concepts of network social analysis, which is the idea of the ego network, in which you have these connections between different people. In this case, it's different people that belong to the circles of these writers. And ego network means that you put the focus on the node, or in this case, the person that you want to study, and look what it's around at a distance of 1 degree, or 2 degrees, or 3 degrees, depending on the context that you want to study. So here what we do is we put ourselves on top of Calderón de la Barca, and we extract all the nodes that are connected to him in this text, or Tirso de Molina or Lope de Vega. This is what in network social analysis is called the ego network. There are many concepts and many different ways of looking at networks depending on what you want to figure out. Another concept, this idea of culture by Boyd and Richardson, in which they analyze culture at evolutionary scale in a book called Not by Genes Alone, in which basically they say that culture is information that affects individuals' behavior. And I think this is a very important thing to take into account for us working in any educational institution, but also from museums, heritage, institutions, anyone really dealing with culture and people. And in the sense that the main difference between heritage that is archived or storing in any institution and culture is that culture still affects people. And we can see that through how they change their behavior when they interact with culture. And the other element, so it's information, it's behavior, it's how it gets transmitted, okay? Through imitation, learning, and other social practices. These are the three main elements of culture. Now, having all these concepts to set the stage, I'm going to be focusing on cultural transmission, okay? With a very simple model in which you have a person that comes out with an idea, and that idea is passed on to another person, and at some point that person changes the idea a little bit. That's what the start symbolizes. But then something that normally happens with cultural transmission is that people and objects travel. And when they travel to another place, they get to a different cultural ecosystem. And they, in some cases, these ideas, they get adopted and adapted. depending on the information that those cultures and those ecosystems work with. Okay, very simple, but basically this is how cultural transmission works in any settings. Any questions, comments, criticisms? No? Okay, we're fine. The evidence of this, and now this is when I'm going to ask you, because I have already worked too much. Where is this? Fruit plate for the winner. Somewhere in Brazil. Okay, another idea. No, yeah, that's much more specific. Okay, you get one of the parameters right, not the others. Any other possibility? Okay, help you a little more. You see the deterioration of the painting, the type of walls, the humidity. This should be something tropical. It's a church, so there should be Christians somewhere around there. Okay, but now about Brazil, but can you read the text there? Which is the language? English, so probably it's not Brazil. Where do we have this type of church, Christian churches? Guatemala, farther away. Ah, we have someone from around there, the other side of the world. We are very self-centered on our own continent, but it's not Goa. You got that wrong. We'll get to close to Goa. This is a place called Kochi, Fort Kochi, one of the most important trade ports in the history of Asia, through which anyone has, almost all civilizations have passed through. And one of the most important presence of the last 500 years is the Christian presence. But if you realize how you were doing the analogies with the elements, that we know is the church, is certain symbols, the construction, but it's the tropic, so where can this be? And you see that every single of these parameters, when you move them to another setting, they change a little bit. But they get some familiarity as well. So these two characters of being familiar and strange have to do a lot with the Baroque or the Baroque that I understand. How about this? We have a cross. We have a little altar there in the street. We have a rooster. Where do roosters come from? In this kind of, see the plate of the car? This could be an European country before joining the European Union or after being expelled out of the European Union. So it has to be the south, Spain, Greece, not Greece, Portugal. There are a few things here that are very Portuguese. The rooster is one of them. Maybe because I was born in Badajoz, in Badajoz, which is 5 minutes from the Portuguese border, and all the decorations that many of the mothers have in the houses are the roosters of different kinds, colors. And then there is a cross. There is an altar there. It has to do with Portugal, but it's in Panjim, which is in Goa. Okay, so again, you see, which is was a Portuguese enclave until very recently. So again, you see these things, these objects that have certain cultural meaning, cultural practices in a place, and they move with people when they move to another part of the world. This is very close in Panjim to this church, which is the Church of the Immaculate Conception in Panjim. Do you see the stairs there? Not the first set, but the second one, where you have the white balusters and the shape that they have. Look at these ones. Portugal. This is the Bom Jesus de Monte in Braga. It's a construction of the 18th century, and you see the same, much more elaborated type of stairs. Here in a very late Baroque, in which every set of the stairs is dedicated with a fountain to one of the senses, sight, hearing, all those things that are very Baroque. And even the labyrinthic impression of the stairs somehow make you do that connection. But you realize that you have this in Portugal, and you have the same architectonic solution on the other side of the world. Okay, again, a model or a pattern that travels with people. This church is very important if you go there, because it's very close to a very nice bar in which they serve a very cold beer, which is very important when you are in the tropics. Around the bar, you have this shop with all these mixed up religious symbols, which are a very important part of the religiosity of India. You have Lord Shiva, Hanuman, Lakshmi, Buddha, a little of everything. And right in the same shop, on the other side of the door, you have also this. Mother Teresa, Virgin Mary, and Lord Ganesh. Cultures and religions coming together in today's world as part of the heritage of mixing of places and people and backgrounds. This is an easy one. Rome. The baldachin of St. Peter's in the Vatican, one of the most famous architectonic and artistic places in the world. I want you to pay attention to the columns that are the famous in the Baroque period Solomonic columns, which have this shape of a drill, which is not that easy to design and to build. Rome, center of the world, center of Baroque art that should be irradiated to everywhere where the Catholic faith would go. Now we have this. It's a burial. Do you know who is buried there? No, because you don't know the place. This is too difficult. But you see the columns? This is the burial site of St. Francis Xavier, the Jesuit, in Veja Goa, in the old Goa of India. Same architectonic solution in the cathedral. So we have Rome, we have Goa, we have this church in the old part of Lima in Peru, same solution. And we have this same solution in anyone? I will up the ante. No. I'll up the ante from a fruit plate to a dinner with me when I come back to Austin next time. I see this is not incentive enough. This is one of the Jesuit missions in Bolivia, in the Amazonic Bolivia, in which the Jesuits in San Javier de Chiquitos, the Jesuits and the local communities build these columns using the whole trunks of certain big trees from the jungle. It's very interesting how these things happen, because we are seeing how ideas and symbols go from one place to another, and they get merged and mixed up. But there's also many of the processes that we know about information, from the DNA to any process of information, and that has to do with deterioration. So they have a museum in which they have many of these same columns from the time in which the Jesuits were expelled, and they more or less became very isolated, and they lost the masters and the tradition to do these kind of things. And you start seeing how these columns get to be completely deformed, and they are not able to perform the function anymore, because they don't know how to make them, the exact technique and the mathematical knowledge to do them well. And you see throughout the years how the information gets deteriorated until it's not useful anymore. To get to these places and to Moxos in the north, you have to go through this means of transportation. You cross the Mamoré River, which is a tributary of the Amazon, and this is the captain of the ponton in which the car has to go. And you, at least in my case, you get very scary about this type of river. And a river, the Amazon is huge, that makes the roads disappear every single year because of the floods. You go through the pre-Amazonic jungle, and you get, after all this, and this is today, this is from a few years ago, in 20th century, and you get to these places, and you get to this perfect local architecture. So imagine how getting to these places would look like in 17th century. And in spite of all that, culture, objects, painting, architecture, ideas travel there and get somehow settled in the places with many local adaptations. In all these missions, still today, you find this. Baroque music from the period. Music that the indigenous people of the region consider their own and value as their way to communicate with God, and that from generation to generation they have been copying and passing down. In every single community there is a family in charge of copying the scores and passing them into the next generation. One of the nice things that we were able to do during this project with the local communities and Piotr Nawrot, one of our musicologists, is to recover and publish all the scores from the musical archive of San Ignacio of Moxos in the north of Bolivia. The interesting thing about culture, and going back to the definition of the beginning, is that this music is being enacted and used in religious acts every single day, every single week, but also in the musical schools that they have restarted as part of their own tradition. And in every single village there are 2, 3, 4 musical schools in which kids compete to go to the regional orchestra, and in some cases to the national orchestra, and in some cases some of these musicians have gone into some of the best orchestras in Europe and North America. So it's something that it's completely alive and part of the daily culture experiences and practices. But if you keep asking where that music comes from, you go to this place. Any idea? Where all the best Baroque music come from originally? Who is the best composer of the best known? Germany? Bach. You're my best student today. Leipzig, where Bach was the master of chapel for a long period of time. So we go back to Europe to see the origin of much of this music that the indigenous people adapt, convert to their own uses, in many cases to their own local languages, to their own practices on the other side of the world. So how does all this work? It's just by pure will of the Jesuits, of the Europeans, who, as you know, are great, or there are underlying laws and rules that somehow can help us understand how these things work or not. And of course, there are laws that have to do with propagation of information. The best cases that we know of propagation of information, especially in the last few days, have to do with viruses and pandemics. Okay? And you have here a picture in which you have certain focus, and through contact and interaction of people, these focuses become bigger and bigger until large areas of any geographic place, region, get contaminated. So this is a way of looking at this thing. But there is also propagation in a network, or the underlying structure of this geographical distribution that we have seen, has to do with what are the networks that connect these roadways through which viruses or information pieces travel. And here we have the same structure that we have today for social networks. Okay? So people being connected through a link. A link can be a message, a picture, a video, contact, whatever it is, okay? And those linkages allow the transmission of a piece of information from one node to another. And through, let me see if I'm able to get this going. Oh. Anyway, through certain rules that have to do with clusterization, with aggregation of nodes, through to the topography of the networks, the information is more prone to be transmitted or not, or to be stopped at certain places. As you know, if you are in health sciences, many of the strategies that the Secretary of Health or any of the international bodies put in place to stop epidemics have to do with stopping traveling of people, cutting down networks so there's no more contact, etc., etc. How does this happen in culture? Remember the original model of transmission that I showed you? Let's see it now with a very specific example. Rubens is probably one of the most important painters of the Baroque. Regardless of how much you like what he did, his importance have to do with how influential he was, okay? And the question is, why was Rubens more influential than Velázquez, for instance? Very simple, but something that we normally don't pay attention to, because Velázquez's paintings were in the walls of the rooms of the king's palace, and only a few noblemen, artists passing by would be allowed into those chambers. So who would see them in order to take them somewhere else? Only a few people. How about Rubens? Rubens had a kind of a startup, a lot of people working for him. Has a huge market of all the Catholic world in Europe, but also the most important expanding market in the Catholic world at the time, Latin America. Okay? But there is a problem. Paintings don't travel very well. Insurance companies know this, that's why they charge so much. So how do you move a painting from one place to another? There are many cases of art historians who have been for decades wondering why is it that this painting that we find in Cusco or in Mexico is so similar to this one that Rubens painted wherever he painted. They copy them, but they copied them in a very specific way, because Rubens was never in Latin America, and not many of his works made their way into Latin America. So there must be something else in between that makes the transmission, as we have the carriers when we're talking about illnesses. In this case, that piece in the middle are the engravings that we have here. So Rubens comes up with a painting that he's going to sell, and then he makes a deal with an engraver that will make a small version, very movable of the same painting. And what's the most interesting cultural objects in terms of moving information until internet? The book. Books travel very well, and you can pack 100 of them in a box, put them in a boat, cross the Atlantic, and pack them on the other side and use them there. So you put all these engravings into books for this type of markets. And when a painter in Cusco receives the book to satisfy a local market of noblemen or the church or whatever, he uses that engraving, originally copied from a Rubens work, to do his own painting with all the local adaptations to satisfy both his aesthetic trends, but also the local market that he has, and with the difference that he hasn't seen the original painting. So the copy is not going to be exact. It's going to be one of the stars that we saw in the original model of cultural transmission. There is always change in the variation. Okay? Now you can explain why you have the Adoration of the Shepherds by Rubens that goes through Bertelsmann, one of the most important engravers of the time, and you have at least, there are many more, but just give you 4 examples, of variations of that painting by Murillo in Seville, by Senén Villa in Madrid, by Juan Correa in Mexico, and by Leonardo Flores in Peru. This painting by Rubens never made it into any place in Latin America, not even to Spain. But through this process of dissemination and cultural transmission, you have the same or very similar messages in many places around the world. Okay? Keep in mind that there are only two ways in which ideas travel. Ideas travel with the human brain. Remember the idea of a mimi? Whatever it's a mimi or not, that's a different discussion, but it's information in the brain, so people travel, or cultural objects travel. There's nothing else that we know of that can transport ideas. And with cultural objects, I mean from books to the internet today. The huge expansion that and mixes of culture and the whole mess that we're experiencing through social networks have to do with the potential of those networks to transmit ideas, videos, music, any cultural objects in digital form to any place in the world that has a connection. Okay? So it's an exponential change to the same thing that we start seeing in this pre-modern or modern expansion in 16th, 17th, and 18th century. The most effective one is the transmission of information through cultural objects. Okay? The expansion through brains is very slow because you have to imagine how many people you have to touch and be in contact with in order for an idea to be spread through personal means. It's very slow. When you have an object and that can be copied automatically or mechanically, that can go to many places and to many people. Okay? That's the main difference and the lever that cultural objects play in the dissemination of ideas and culture. When we do a network analysis of all the paintings by Rubens that we have, and people connected to the distribution of his paintings, you see that the bigger nodes are not even Rubens himself, are Bortsmann and Bolsward, who are the two main engravers of the time. This is how the information about Rubens' paintings was distributed. And when you see the main cities of the world of the time through which the paintings were distributed, you see that the most important is Cusco, because Cusco would receive these books and would play to a whole market that covered part of what is today Argentina, Peru, and even Colombia. So the most important center of replication and distribution of paintings related to Rubens is in Cusco, not in the Low Countries in Europe. Now, if we extend our thought a little bit, and this is only the beginning of modernity, this is much more clear today, in which we have organizations like Facebook, in which there are 1,700 million people connected to a single network. Can we think that at some point can we have global communities? And the question is, what do we mean by a global community? Theoreticians think of a community as a group of people that share the same information. So there are basically two things, people and information. And if you have a group of people that share some level of information, not everything, you have a community at least at that level, which is what you have in the groups of Facebook, in the groups of people that are your friends, in dorms, in families. They are different types of community. But basically what you have is people that share certain types of information, and it's very weird that all of those groups to which you belong share everything. But at some level, normally they share at least one or two pieces of information related to the country, the community, the school, whatever it is. So what type of information would we have in order to determine if there is a global community in the period, in the 17th century, in the Baroque period? We thought that what we had to look for is information in cultural objects. And we have all these different pieces of evidence that I have shown you about architecture, music, art, literature, and all this. So what we thought is, if I have a group in Spain another in Mexico, another in Peru, and another in Goa that shared the same piece of information, we can talk about a potential global community. Global in the sense that it is spread throughout the different continents, not that it covers every single group or land on Earth. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. How do we prove that? We go to build a database of paintings of the Baroque period, late 16th, 17th, 18th century, with the locations in which these paintings, as much as we have it, were painted for, were commissioned, were stored, were used, all that information that historians of art have been collecting for centuries. And then my question is, remember the works by Rubens, replicated by Murillo, Villa, Correa, etc. All those paintings have certain symbols related normally to the iconography of that particular painting, which are common to all of them. So those are the pieces of information that we are looking for, because we know where those paintings were. So we know, if we are able to determine those pieces of information, that information was distributed to all these places, and that even if they didn't know each other, like we in many cases don't know someone that I communicate with through Facebook on the other side of the world, they make a community of some kind because they share that religious information. Okay? How do we measure that in order to see how distributed this information is? Okay, bear with me a little bit. You have an artwork, a painting, and you have these descriptors that normally today are called metadata. And you see that artwork has a descriptor 1, a descriptor 2, a descriptor 3, whatever descriptors they have. And descriptors are type of colors, iconography, motifs, anything that you normally describe in a catalog of a painting. Because all this information is taken from many catalogs done by art historians. So how do I know if artwork 1 is similar to artwork 2? Then this is with mathematicians are useful. They are useful for many other things. But in this case, it's not that they are completely similar. It's what degree of similarity they have. This is what they ask for. And they say that two paintings are as similar as the number of descriptors that they have in common. Okay? So painting 1 has 5 descriptors, and painting 2 have 7 descriptors. Of those 5 and 7, they have 3 in common. For instance, that they are oil on canvas, that they use green, and that there is a figure of the Virgin Mary. Okay? So then we say that the similarity measure of those 2 paintings is 3. If they have everything in common, it's that they are complete replicas. If they have 5, it's a degree 5. Okay? So we have this database of over 15,000 paintings of the period with all these descriptors that make up what is called an ontology of 200 types of metadata. Now you have 2 problems here. What is the threshold that you know in order to determine that 2 paintings are relevantly similar? Because if they have only 2 or 3 descriptors in common, probably mean that they are both oil on canvas and maybe there is the same figures or the same colors. Doesn't tell you much. So what you need is a threshold that is higher. Like you need like 5, 6, 7, 8 descriptors together. Okay? So that you know, for instance, when you talk about two people, in my case, I need someone to be in common with me, being bald, maybe that speaks Spanish, maybe that it's my age, my height, my weight, all those things, in order to really see the color of the eyes, of the expression, in order to really determine if someone is similar to me in a relevant way. The same thing with paintings. And then when you have all this in common, all this information, what do? An operation that in mathematics is called clusterization. So what you have here is all these paintings divided into 25 years period. Okay? And the clusters, which are those balls that you see there, are paintings that are connected through the same descriptors. So they have the degree of similarity. I think that we use 8 or 9 as a degree of similarity, because if you make it much lower, the computing power to operate the whole thing doesn't work. So you have to raise it anyway. So what we have here is clusters, groups of paintings that are similar because they have certain number of descriptors in common. Okay? And what we see here also through the division through 25 years periods is that these clusters evolve over time, that they change. Okay? A couple of comments. Probably many of you already know this, but this is the same technique with many more data that Facebook uses or Amazon to offer you a product. Because you are connected to many other people, like the paintings, who have the same descriptors. And they know that when you have the same descriptors that other people have, through a mathematical concept called homophily, probably you are going to do with certain degree of probability the same things that those other people do. Okay? This is the whole thing behind Facebook, and that they have millions and millions and millions of data that we freely give them every single day. I say Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, Snapchat, anything that has underneath a network structure. Remember that the first thing that any network asks you is to link with your friends. Give me your agenda from the phone. Why? Because they want to know what's your structure of homophily, who are your similar people. Okay? The second thing, and this I always put this, I'm not an art historian, but to art historians or any people in any discipline, the important thing about this is that these clusterizations are not the genres that normally art historians classify works in. Those classifications come out of the traditions and how individuals, out of a lot of expertise and study, see patterns in paintings, and they say this is of this genre, this is of the other genre. This comes out of the data. We didn't do anything. We didn't impose any model into it. If they have certain number of things in common, they are the same. So one of the questions that we always put to any people working in disciplinary boundaries is, what does all this tell us about other ways of studying art, or studying literature, or studying architecture? What if we are able to make a theory or analyze all those brown clusters there, or the blue? Do we know what type of paintings come together there? Why? Is there something there that experts can tell us about? And I think that this is one of the challenges that we have beyond the digital humanities. All these interesting questions that we haven't been able to see, because the human capacity, even for the great professors and researchers, to analyze information is limited. Okay? Now we translate this information into this. These are heat maps with very traditional drawings here, in which we have the same information, extracting certain descriptors which are important and relevant to art history and to history of the religions and cultures. So the different colors in the legend there determine if they are religious paintings, they are civil, they are portraits, saints, virgins, Christians, immaculate conceptions, and whatever. And then here you see a map of evolution of these 2 centuries or over 2 centuries in terms of the different motifs that and how they change over time. In all this, that in many cases is considered, and I will go into it, Mexican painting or Spanish painting or Peruvian painting, and the question is why. One of the things that we analyze in a little more detail in an article that we published about this is how over time religious theme goes down in quantity in all these communities. And you start having more and more portraits, but they are not portraits of Christ or saints. They are portraits of civil leaders, politicians, rich people from the future bourgeoisie. And the question is why? And the reason is that all these communities were already preparing the independencies. They were preparing to become republics, and they needed different symbols, different models of people. And these models were portrayed in all these paintings that we see change over time. They're going into a more civil kind of description of the depiction of the society they were building. The same thing we saw in combination with an analysis that we did of the history of the town of Potosí in Bolivia, of the adaptation of the different virgins to the localities. Think that the virgin is the most important concept to understand how the Baroque works, because the virgin is a universal symbol that is the same everywhere in which you have Christianity. But the virgins are always local. I mean, you don't have a general virgin anywhere, maybe in some place. But in my city, there is a virgin of the Soledad. In the other place is virgin of the Desamparados, is the virgin of everywhere. The virgin is local. But being a Virgin Mary is also universal. And what we know, and now we have been able to prove through the analysis of our son's text, is that some of the things that we have said about the local indigenous female deities becoming entrenched into the Catholic concepts, you see this in all these models, because you have the general concept that is applied to anywhere and connect these communities with Rome, with Madrid, with Peru, with Mexico, all together, one to another. But at the same time, the virgin of the place is the virgin of that community, not only of the city, of the town, of the neighborhood. We have gone to the detail of the parish in the analysis of our son's book. So it's total, if you want globalization at some level, total localization at an adaptation at another level. That also brings about the question of, is the history of the viceroyalty of Peru the framework that we need? Is the history of the art in New Spain the frame that we need? Because we extract some of the common paintings of this database and we put them up on the map, and you see that they are all over the place. That the cultural areas, if you want, would be completely different or complementary to the cultural areas that we have normally divided our historical studies in. You see that there are certain things related especially to the Canary Islands that you see across all places in Latin America. Others are more related to the Pacific coast. Others are very local to the discussions and debates between Puebla and Mexico. So there are different levels at which we can study this to have different stories and different narratives about our cultural experiences of the past, beyond the traditional boundaries that we have put through disciplines. Think that all these histories are histories of the national states that you see even more clearly here. In this case, what we have is a selection of paintings from this same database. And on the red side, the red end of these flows, you have the places for which these paintings were painted, were commissioned. Okay? And remember that this type of art was a very practical art. It was for liturgy, for rituals. They were in local houses for the religion of the family, churches, local parishes. So they were not art as we conceive of art today. They were used. So what we have here, as we said, is the origin of the paintings. The thickness of the flow has to do with the volume of art, of painting, that has gone to the green places, which is where those paintings are today. Okay? And you see a lot of things if you want to do post-colonial history about this. The history of the museums, you see in many cases that these are going from local places in which the paintings were used for religious reasons to museums, which are one of the most important institutions of the late 19th and 20th century. And these museums that are used, especially at the beginning, to build the narratives of the nations are mainly in the capitals of the countries. So you see that in many cases the paintings go from the original places in Latin America to Europe or to the States, but in many of the cases they go from local places to the capitals where the museums are, in a similar movement for different reasons. Okay? Again, something that we can have ideas about, but that you can prove and track through this kind of technology to try to figure out new ideas, new narratives, new ways of explaining why art and any manifestation of human culture is important and how we can study. Just a couple of ideas to finish. Remember the three main theories or definitions of the Baroque that we had at the beginning. It's applied to an individual work, to a genre or a period, or to a whole culture. After studying all this from this perspective, my proposal is this. Really, Baroque is something that an operation that is related to cultural transmission, and the resulting objects of doing those changes and moving those objects. Baroque always shows a similarity and closeness to the thing that we are looking, but also some kind of deformation because we see that what we are looking at is not completely exact as the original. The farther the distance between the objects or the stages in the transmission, how many transmissions the object has gone through, the more deformed it looks to us, the more different. But there is always this air of similarity in which we are able to trace back something to something that we already know. I think that this is really what the Baroque is about. Only that we put it to a specific periods and times and objects because we did the history of that first period of modernity that somehow opens up the world that we're still living in today. You see this? This is a post-colonial artist from New Zealand in an art gallery of Australia now, Greg Semu, which he takes the last dinner of the most important and well-known paintings of the Western tradition and makes something more out of it, putting the indigenous element and the blackness and the irony to deform the original idea without taking away completely from it in a single composition. In any way, when we talk about culture, when we talk about mergers, migrations, movement of cultural objects, the most important things are always the people behind them, those cultural agents, either in the jungle of Bolivia, in an enacting of traditional Japan in Kyoto today, or transmoved and transcultural Spanish-Canadian children in snowy Canada. It's people that really matters and the culture that they take along with them, because we live through our cultures. This is it. Thank you.
Very interesting, and I'm sure a lot of you have questions, so we can open up the floor for that.
Can you talk more about the data, how you harvested or how you gathered that data to do the analytics?
Yeah, well, the gathering was a sweatshop, I have to confess. We had a group of people out of a project that we had, undergraduate students basically, coordinated by an art historian, collecting information for over 2 years, going through catalogs and books and even the little pamphlet that we were able to get our hands on by a priest in the last church in that village that nobody goes to. We get everything and try to put it together. And that's an important question because most of analysis of culture, of anything using data are normally of contemporary experiences. And that has to do with the fact that those data are already digitized because we produce it through internet and the cell phones already in digital format. When we go back to the past, the data is most of cases not digitized. And there is a curve of adopting and integrating that data into anything. It's books, maps, anything you have to digitize them, extract the information, and that takes a lot of work. In some cases, sort of blocks you from getting into the next step. The other very interesting part of this project is that we had a lot of discussions with mathematicians, computer scientists, people from the humanities in general, and art historians about what's the ontology, the classification of descriptors that would be the most useful for us. And we sort of put away many of the traditional, more canonical ontologies out there, because really didn't capture the type of data that we wanted to use. And this was like 10 years ago, so all those models were a little slow. So we developed our own ontology, which is also published in our website to be reused. We decided to go with descriptors. The original database is a normal database, SQL, but after that we work more, and we developed even a model based on graph databases. Database in which the data is already stored in network format, so that the processing part is easier to perform, and gives you more freedom in terms of creating the model of the data, because you don't have to do a hierarchy like in an ontology. You can do a network in which different metadata, different descriptors have different weights depending on what you are trying to represent.
How do you control for the quality of the metadata? By that I mean, you describe the metadata as facts and as, you know, basically something very objective. And there's, you know, we can have a lot of disagreement about that, in the sense that even just the spelling, for example, of in Latin America, of a group's name according to Spanish spelling and according to the indigenous spelling, those things could skew things significantly, simply because the descriptors no longer match, even by, you know, changing one letter. Yeah. Or even the assignation of something to a culture could be a matter of debate. And you use Baroque, and, you know, I'm just going to say let's use Olmec as a descriptor for Mesoamerica. Whether something is Olmec or not Olmec, depending on where it comes from and which cultural group it belongs to, could also really throw off the pattern. So you might look at something as just a descriptor and a fact, but it takes a lot of cultural interpretation to get to that starting point already. So I'm asking you, do you see this working in any way separate from the art historians that have made those determinations? Do you think the thing is not going to work unless you integrate that perspective, or what's your thought?
Yeah, very relevant question. A couple of thoughts. We went through those problems, and the more variety in the world that you are studying, the more difficult to come up with any valid set of descriptors. And I use valid as opposed to completely truthful or objective, in the sense of what is the question you are trying to answer. They are data, not facts. And we, as I said at the beginning, we took them from art historians. So all that is embedded in there. And we try to do that, first because we were not experts, and there's a lot of them, and people have already done the work, but also because on the other side you have the art historians who say, did you come out with this by yourself? And we would be on the other side being hit by, you don't know enough. So that's very relevant. So what we decided, and we have been working on this a lot for many different problems, and I say my team and the mathematicians, is trying to work with the most flexible mathematical structure to avoid as much as possible those problems, which is a network. So when you have an ontology, you create a hierarchy, and at some point you get limited to what you can add. What we have done with most of the work we do is create a network. So if you want to integrate a new point of view, you don't need to go into a hierarchy saying this is lower or higher than whatever you have already put in there, which in this case, for this example, is the interpretations of the art historians. And you don't have any problem of hierarchies. You have dependencies according to how this new set of descriptors get connected to the rest, but they can be added without interfering as much and offering that different perspective. So this is a very relevant problem. We also work with indigenous communities in Ontario, basically, and this is one of the things that they tell us. This is not my view of the world. I say, of course this is not. Put your own. And of course there are limits into the mathematics of it. But this is the best that we have in that work. And in some cases they are satisfied with that. It's a problem that comes up a lot when you work, for instance, In Ontario, there's a law in which you start doing a road, excavating anything. The moment you find something from any of the indigenous groups of the place, you have to store it by yourself or give it to an institution. There's a lot of that, and there are institutions at universities doing those databases and catalogs and all that. But when we embarking off those projects, in many cases what we create is a different facet in which those objects are organized according to whatever the community decides. Because in some cases they are important objects for them, and not in artistic terms, or in terms of heritage. They use it for religious or historical or memory reasons. So that's a very important question. The most advanced mathematical object to do that is the network, the graph database, which you can introduce new perspectives without affecting whatever you have there. But it's not objective. It's an interpretation through data. There was a question. Yeah.
So I'm intrigued about how computing and mathematics sort of breaks down Baroque production and looks at its transmission. But I have a question in terms of the Baroque and modernity. Okay. One of the reasons why we study the Baroque is because there's this historical meta-narrative, if you want to call that, rather than methodology, that has to do with periodical conceptions of Western historical development and the confrontation between the West and the non-West, right? It has to do with the Renaissance, the period of conquest and colonization, issues of cultural transmission back and forth between Europe and the Americas, and how that has led to modernity or to the Enlightenment. So that there is the Renaissance, there's the Baroque, then there's the American Baroque, and all these deformations, and then you have a break with the deformations that the Baroque brought to the classical norms of the Renaissance, and then you move into modernity, which actually has a different sort of set of aesthetic and human and political values from the Baroque era. And now, with the crisis of modernity, we go back to there's a sort of revival of the Baroque because of the exhaustions of Enlightenment. So there's a very interesting sort of history that sort of helped us understand the troubles of the West as it confronts it and works. I'm still wondering what your data is telling us concerning about the way in which we need to conceive of the relationship between artistic and cultural production and historical processes. The thing that I see about sort of reducing the Baroque into a data bank is that in the end it sort of makes it a pure formalism, and it doesn't allow us full understanding or greater insight into where we're at concerning what has happened in the history.
I agree with you until the last part of it.
With the database and the formalism, I also agree with that if you just leave it at that. As I always say, with anything related to digital and data, this is only a tool. The important thing is the questions that you have. And that's where you connect this or whatever. And at the end of the day, this is the same that you do with text, or I do with text. It's a tool to interpret the world of the past or the world of today. So it's in the question and in the frame that you are trying to explain that it's really important.
What does this tell us about, what do you think this tells us about the relationship between Baroque and modernity? Because essentially what you're describing is a process of globalization that seems to sort of be prevalent since the 17th century now, and basically what you show is a map of transmission of these particular sorts of cultural objects related to the Baroque that seem to sort of be everywhere. Right? But what happens with the Enlightenment? What happens with the 19th century? You know, there's a big sort of absence in terms of something that is not accounted for in terms of the data that you are collecting.
Yeah, I think that there are, at least in the history of the world and modernity,
there are at least two different interpretations of how. And when I say interpretations, I also say two wills to put into the world, to shape the world according to those wills. And one is that of order, differentiation of peoples and groups, classifications, technology, specific economic system. And there is another model that you see more clear here, not compared to that first model, in which there are much more richness in the complexity, in the disorder, in the many different cultural systems, looking for ways to coexist at different levels. I use the word Baroque, but really my last definition has to do with this just being a name for something that happens when you mix cultures. And I think that somehow this is still the debate that we have today. The sensation of chaos that we have, which probably has to do with certain instability, is also an incapacity to look into other patterns of what's going on. And when we don't see certain patterns, we think immediately into chaos or emptiness. And I think that there are other things going on, but we have to make the effort to account for them. I don't know if... Okay.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And I always finish our talks with announcements and with invitations. So first of all, I want to invite you again to the Blanton Galleries if you have not been there. And if you want to see or hear, listen to some of the music that you showed on the one of the slides, music from the missions in Bolivia. Come to the Blanton in February. We're going to have the Austin Baroque Orchestra performing that music and in the museum. So keep posted with all the things that we're going to continue doing around the colonial period. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So there's lots of food left over. Please take it with you.